Stephen Barnes has written episodes for television shows like Andromeda, Stargate SG-1, and The Outer Limits, but he's predominantly known as a science fiction, fantasy, and mystery writer. Barnes is deeply interested in martial arts, and his interest in them is very apparent in his works. And in 2004, he was the first Star Wars author who was a person of color. Even now, to this day, the realm of published authors are predominantly white. So while it surprises me that it took this long, looking at the state of especially science fiction at the time, that lack of diversity shouldn't have come as a surprise to me. So while the cover of the Cestus Deception looked very familiar to me, the content of the book wasn't, so I'm not sure if I read it or if I just saw it, but nothing more. So, a brief summary. When the economically depressed planet of Ord Cestus makes a deal to sell killer droids to the Separatists, Supreme Chancellor Palpatine dispatches a team of 2 Jedi, Obi-Wan Kenobi and Kit Fisto, to the planet to halt the deal at any cost. If diplomacy fails, the Republic will not hesitate to unleash an attack on Ord Cestus, and that is a result that Obi-Wan Kenobi very much wants to prevent. The Cestus Deception very much felt like a war novel to me, but in a different way than Shatterpoint by Matthew Stover was. The first half of the book is pretty much Obi-Wan trying to pursue the diplomatic route, while Kit Fisto and the 4 clone troopers are training the local populace in how to become a guerrilla terrorist movement. And when Obi-Wan's attempts at diplomacy fail, they shift 100% over to basically terrorist attacks against the factories and cities on Ord Cestus. The 5 families that rule Ord Cestus have developed these JK-class droids, which are nicknamed Jedi Killers, and Palpatine says that they must be stopped at any cost. But the 5 families won't listen to Obi-Wan. The title Deception goes very much awry, and the situation on Ord Cestus is more complicated than Obi-Wan initially assumed. The indigenous people of Ord Cestus, the insectile X-Ting, were almost completely wiped out by a plague over 100 years ago, and they have very little control over what happens on their own planet. So throughout the novel, Obi-Wan is trying to reconcile his concern for everyone that lives on Ord Cestus, his concern for how the indigenous people have been taken advantage of and misused and become relegated to lower class citizens merely because they didn't have the political adeptness to realize what they were signing away. And he doesn't want the Republic to step in and start bombarding Ord Cestus, but he's also not 100% behind these terrorist attacks, but these terrorist attacks seem to be the only way that they can get the 5 families to agree to stop production of these deadly droids. And there's just a lot of different factions at play here. Besides the 5 families, there's the Regent, although mainly she's a regent in name only, Regent Duris. There's a crime boss named Trillot and Trillot's relations. There's the Desert Wind, local guerrilla group that Kit Fisto takes over and trains up. And then we have a viewpoint character clone trooper, A98, or Nate, who is going through a lot of emotional stuff, trying to figure out who he is. Is he a distinct person beyond his identity as a clone of Jango Fett? And what does he want? And who is he? And then, of course, also we've got separatist scheming. So even though Count Dooku appears on the cover, he's not in the story at all. Instead, we have Asajj Ventress, who's dispatched to get the 5 ruling families to hand over what they agreed to. And then when she hears that Obi-Wan Kenobi's here, she very much wants to kill him. And actually a little awkward at one point, I don't know, her desire to kill Kenobi is described as a fleshly hunger, and I was just like, okay. So there's a lot going on in the Cestus Deception, and there are a lot of balls up in the air. Of the Jedi, I felt like I didn't get much of a handle on Kit Fisto because we spend very little time in his head. Most of the time we're in Nate's head, or we're in Obi-Wan's head, and how they perceive Kit. So really all I got is that he uses Form 1, the form of lightsaber combat. He's always like sort of on the edge of being very angry, but he's a very skilled warrior, and I wanted a little more insight into his character, but that's pretty much all we got. Obi-Wan is very zen here. I didn't always get as much of his snark, just more of Alec Guinness Obi-Wan and less of Ewan McGregor Obi-Wan, a bit like we saw in The Approaching Storm by Alan Dean Foster, where you see him as a Jedi first and foremost, and less so him as a character and like his personality traits. He's a lot more balanced here. He's very much concerned for what's going on Ord Cestus. Is he going to be able to fulfill his mission? He sympathizes with Regent Duris, and he also questions what they're doing, but he's pretty calm about it right up until the final battle with Ventress. Barnes also made the interesting decision to not include Anakin in this story at all. And at first I was like, yeah, I guess that makes sense. This is an Obi-Wan and Kit story. But then I read an interview with him that had been on the StarWars.com website, where he said the reason he omitted Anakin was because he had no idea how Anakin was going to turn to the dark side. He couldn't get in his head, so it was better to leave him out. But I feel like leading into Revenge of the Sith, a lot of people's sense of Anakin was that he was going to fall to the dark side because he's very angry and he's very attached to his family. Maybe his fall was going to be wrapped up in his relationship with her. So yeah, that made me side-eye him a little, like, really, Barnes? Really? You don't understand why Anakin would fall at all? And I found Nate an interesting character here, that he is a clone trooper. He is one of a million identical ones, but as we spend more time with the clones, we see how unidentical they are, that they received basically the same upbringing, but their training has been different. The situations they've gone through since the Clone Wars started has been different, and he's trying to find his identity apart from everyone else like him. I liked the idea of this, but the actual execution I had some issues with, but we'll hold that off for the issues section. Their local contact on Ord Cestus is a woman named Sheeka Tull, who has a family there, stepchildren. She's an interesting character. It turns out she was Jango Fett's ex, that when she was much younger, she was in a relationship with him for a short period of time. But then her backstory seemed a little bit too Jean Valjean from Les Mis for me, that as Valjean stole a loaf of bread to feed his sister's children, the reason she's in trouble is because she went to an interdicted planet to make sure they got medical help. So I guess she can't be bad. She still has to be good. And yeah, issues with her arc, but I'll save that for the issues section. And I liked Regent Duris, who is definitely stuck between a rock and a hard place, in that she's trying to not just serve in the best interest of her people, the X-Ting, but she's also trying to serve in the best interest of everyone who lives on Ord Cestus, but she's really holds no power, and her relative, who is a member of the 5 families, holds a lot of power over her head. I do wish, though, that the X-Ting had felt more alien. They're these human-sized insects, and apparently every 3 to 5 years they swap genders, so they go back and forth between being male and female. They just didn't feel particularly alien to me, especially for this insectile race. They speak basic and their names looked very human, I guess. And you could probably argue that that is like the basic translation because their actual language is described as sounding like clicks. But I wish they had been a little bit strange or a little bit foreign to the human characters. And I felt like the subplot with Trillot and the underworld X-Ting was like sort of unnecessary in the end. I think I would have rather that Asajj Ventress came in and met with Quill, the very mean, violent member of the 5 families who was holding all this stuff over the Regent's head, instead of introducing like this underworld character who felt very underdeveloped. Like Trillot is there basically to give Obi-Wan information and to give Ventress information, and she dies in the end, and I would have, I don't know, condensed that. So my first issue with the Cestus Deception is that Barnes made the interesting choice to have a lot of very short chapters here. The book is 82 chapters long, and it's like a mid-sized Star Wars book. So what that means is some chapters are like 1 page, 2 pages. And for me, it did affect the flow of reading. I think that when chapters are done right, you don't really notice how they're broken up, but when it's not working for you, you notice those separations more. There's so many chapter breaks, and I wondered why. It would be like we would cut away to some character's viewpoint, but it's just 1 page, and we would have chapters where we would cut back and forth between viewpoint characters, so I didn't really understand what the distinction was there, and it did make the flow to me feel a bit choppy and not fluid. And I guess here, in the Cestus Deception, what the Jedi do seemed particularly un-Jedi to me, and I think that's the war novel coming through, that Obi-Wan comes here and wants to achieve a diplomatic goal, but at the same time, he's been planning from the beginning this deception to make it look like Kit Fisto is a separatist goon of Count Dooku who's going to abduct members of the 5 families, and then Obi-Wan's going to come in and save them, and that's going to turn them against Dooku and make them go back to the Republic. But in doing that, they're straight up lying. They're lying to the 5 families, they're lying to the Regent, and somewhat improbably, Obi-Wan gets caught in a lie. I guess Ventress recorded it, and it's obvious that, like, he's not really killing the Desert Wind separatist people. He's just, like, his lightsaber swings and it doesn't really make contact. So they know he faked it, and they're so mad, and they tell him to leave, and he goes to leave, and, like, Ventress blows up his ship, and he sneaks back to Kit. But, like, I guess I have trouble believing that Obi-Wan would be okay with this plan to begin with. I think that within the Clone Wars, the Jedi start to do things that maybe they wouldn't have done in times of peace, and that's like the slippery edge they start to go down. That we saw with Depa and Shatterpoint, that the Jedi are doing things they are never meant to do, and this is going to have an adverse effect on them. I guess I'm just honestly surprised that Obi-Wan didn't put up more resistance to this plan, because it's lying, it's faking things, it's not being truthful. Obviously, when we get to the original trilogy, Obi-Wan has no problem saying, well, it's true from a certain point of view, but I don't know, this felt like a step too far for me. I think my biggest problem with the Cestus Deception is that I think that Barnes had some interesting ideas here, but I don't like how they were executed. So take Nate and his journey to discover who he is. Like, is he a separate person beyond his identity as a clone of Jango Fett? And that's interesting. I like delving into the clones here and how people perceive the clones. In Shatterpoint, we saw that Mace Windu has trouble looking at them because when he sees them, he sees Jango, a man that he killed, and that brings back all his thoughts of, was that the right thing to do or not? And here, I get the sense that the Jedi don't always see the clones as like distinct individuals, and it makes them uncomfortable in a way. And so Nate's trying to figure out who he is as a person makes a lot of sense to me. But all these revelations come about because he's interacting with Sheeka Tull, who sees Nate and sees her ex from 20 years ago, and they end up like having a romantic relationship, and she says that he needs to choose his own name that's not a number, and so he chooses the name Jango Tat, which apparently means Jango's brother, and I'm like, ooh. And he is like, I could have a life with this woman, but he chooses to go back to the clone troopers, and then he's the reason that the 5 families are basically wiped out, and instead of bombarding innocent places, they just bombard the 5 families, and then we find out in the end that, like, she's pregnant with his child, and, here's the thing. I think there is a very creepy aspect to Sheeka having a relationship with someone who is literally a clone of her ex. Beyond the age difference, there's also the fact that she sees him and she sees Jango. But Nate is not Jango, and yet he takes a name that she gives him, which means Jango's brother. And so much of his emotional journey is prompted by Sheeka, and it's just exceptionally creepy. I don't mind Sheeka being a part of his journey here, but I think making her Jango's ex was a step too far and just makes this feel very, very wrong. I think there's enough questions you can get into about clones having romantic relationships when they've gone through vastly abbreviated upbringing, that they did not have a normal childhood, they didn't have parents who raised them, and they age very quickly. And so you could say, like, yes, he looks like a grown man, but he's really only lived 10 years in the galaxy, and get into questions of morality about relationships there. But just the whole aspect of Sheeka being formally involved with his clone progenitor is just, oh, it's wrong. It's so wrong. And she's like, was it wrong for me to, like, get him to think all these things? And Obi-Wan's like, no, you just did it out of love. And I'm like, oh, God. Ooh, this bothers me. This bothered me a lot. And I think that's just the majority of the novel here, where I think that Barnes had interesting ideas, but they don't work for me, either because I find it creepy or because I question if the Jedi would really do things like that. The whole thing of them becoming terrorists, and like they're trying their hardest not to kill people, but they're still committing acts of terror. I had trouble with this one. And just the entire concept of the JK droids, that they're force sensitive because they've got eels inside, but then it turns out that the eels, those were actually sterile juvenile eels, and they can't commit harm, so the droids never would have been a threat to begin with. I don't know, the droids just felt like an excuse to get them there, but I found the droids hard to visualize, and then in the end they were sort of like a non-issue to begin with. So, in short, the Cestus Deception was not one of my favorite Clone Wars stories. I think particularly because while some of the ideas that Barnes has in here were intriguing, I didn't like their actual execution, and especially some of the plot elements I was just completely not on board with. I think that it's very interesting how he fleshes out the inner lives of the clones. I just very much would have preferred that our ARC trooper here not be in a relationship with one of Jango Fett's ex-girlfriends. And it bothered me that the Jedi were behaving like terrorists here, that Obi-Wan was lying to people and not really having a problem with it. So next time I'm going to be reading an ebook novella by Stephen Barnes that's set during the Cestus Deception, The Hive.